Is Matthew chapter 2 the most unique chapter in any of the four Gospels? I don't know. Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, what's going on? My name is Mickey and welcome to Let's Talk About the Bible. I hope that you're ready and excited to talk about the Bible with me today because that is what we do here. In fact, that is pretty much all that we do here. We talk about the Bible, and I know that I'm so ready and so excited to continue talking about Matthew chapter 2 with y'all today. That's right, we already, in our last video, we were talking about the first kind of half of Matthew chapter 2, so if you haven't watched that yet, then you absolutely need to watch that video before you watch this. When we talked about the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 2 in that video, we're going to be picking up right where we left off in this video. So you're going to be a little lost if you haven't watched the video that comes before this one. So if you haven't already, go watch that video. The link will be down in the description. I'll put it up in the top right corner of the screen right here. You can just click on it. It'll take you right there. And then you can come back and watch this one. So without further ado, let's dive back into Matthew chapter 2. In our last video on Matthew chapter 2, which was actually our first video on Matthew chapter 2, we kind of outlined this chapter. We split it up into 4 sections. I'll throw that outline up on the screen right now so that you can see it. We really split that first section, as you can see, is a good bit longer than the second, second, third, and fourth section. So we spent most of our time talking about that first section. We're going to be picking up at the beginning of the second section today, and we're going to talk about the rest of this chapter. So let's get it going. Let's dive in. This second section in Matthew chapter 2 starts off with yet another dream that the Lord uses to speak to Joseph, and the Lord warns Joseph in a dream to flee to Egypt. He tells Joseph to get your wife, get your son, and flee to Egypt because King Herod knows that baby Jesus is in Bethlehem, and Herod is going to try to kill Jesus. Our suspicions that we talked about last video are finally confirmed here for us by the Lord. And once again, we see in these verses that Joseph is just immediately obedient. It says that after this dream, Joseph got up, he got his wife, he got his kid, they got their stuff, and they fled to Egypt. In the middle of the night, it says Joseph didn't even wait till the morning. Joseph knew this was an absolutely urgent matter, so he fled immediately with his family to Egypt, just like the Lord commanded him to. So these verses tell us that they fled to Egypt and they stayed there until the eventual death of Herod. And then in verse 15, to conclude this very short section, we see that once again, all of this is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. What a shocker. Matthew quotes at the end of verse 15 an Old Testament prophecy from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1 that says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So this prophecy doesn't even actually say anything about the Messiah having to flee to Egypt at some point or the Messiah being in danger from an evil king or anything like that. This prophecy essentially says that the Messiah at some point is going to come out of Egypt. So this prophecy hasn't technically even been fulfilled yet in this section. This section just shows us why the Messiah had to go to Egypt in the first place. And obviously if you go to Egypt, then you're going to have to come out of it at some point, right? So that's the prophecy that this short section is centered around. Now let's move on to section number 3, verses 16 through 18. And let me go ahead and warn you up front, okay? This very short section, again, is pretty difficult to read, okay? It's a little hard to stomach. I just want to go ahead and warn you. Matthew switches here from the perspective of Joseph back to the perspective of Herod in Jerusalem, and Herod has just found out that the wise men are not coming back. Remember, he asked the wise men to go find baby Jesus, to go find where he was, and then come back and tell him, and he's just found out that the wise men are not coming back to tell him where baby Jesus is. I'm not sure if he found out by someone else that the wise men had gone home a different way, or maybe just enough time had passed to where he assumed they weren't coming back. But either way, Herod was furious. Herod was enraged because verse 16 tells us that he thought he was deceived. He thought the wise men had planned this and they had planned to trick him to deceive him. He thought they did this on purpose. We know that isn't the case. I think the wise men were originally going to go back and tell King Herod where Jesus was until God warned them in a dream in verse 12 to not go back to Herod, to go home a different way. But either way, Herod didn't know that. Herod felt deceived. Herod felt tricked. He was angry. And he was angry not only because he felt lied to, but he was angry because now he was no closer to finding out who this young king of the Jews was. So, Herod was mad, and we know that Herod tended to do some pretty horrible things when he got mad, and this time was no exception. Since Herod knew where the young child was, but he had no way of knowing who the young child was, he sent some of his men down to Bethlehem, and he ordered them to slaughter every single male child that was 2 years old or younger in the town of Bethlehem and in all of the towns surrounding Bethlehem, just for good measure. Herod figured that if he couldn't pinpoint the specific child that was a threat to his throne, then he would just kill all of the children, not just in that town, but in the entire area, because that was a small price to pay in his mind for him to be able to retain his power and his throne. I mean, guys, this is just a cruel, evil man. It makes me sick to my stomach to think about this tragedy. It's honestly hard for me to even imagine the heartbreak that these families undoubtedly experienced and just the complete and total lack of remorse that Herod showed. Now, one question that I have heard asked before is, why 2 years old and younger? What did Herod base that age off of? And if you remember, back at the very beginning of this chapter, one of the very first things Herod does when he met with the wise men was he asked them how long they had been following that star in the sky. I believe that the reason he asked them that was because he assumed that that star probably popped into the sky around the same time that this king of the Jews was born. So if he could gauge how long they'd been following the star, he could gauge about how old this young child was. Like I said, we think that Jesus was probably a few months old, maybe a year old, and I'm assuming Herod just bumped it up to 2 years old just to be extra safe. Like I said, he didn't care if a few more kids, innocent children, were going to die because of his actions. He was completely, he lacked any remorse. He was just going to do whatever it took to make sure that he held on to his authority and his throne. Now, obviously, we can't move on to the next section until we talked about an Old Testament prophecy, right? This section ends in verse 18 by Matthew showing us that even this horrible massacre was actually a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. In verse 18, Matthew quotes here from Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15, and this prophecy fulfillment is actually a pretty unique one, okay? This one's interesting. Because if you read that verse, Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15, in its original context, you would realize that Jeremiah was not talking about the Messiah. Jeremiah wasn't even talking about the future. In its context, Jeremiah was writing about the Israelite exiles that were being shipped off to Babylon, and he uses Rachel as an example of all of the mothers in Israel mourning over their sons being shipped off to Babylon. But what's so cool to me about this prophecy is that whether Jeremiah knew it or not at the time, Matthew shows us that Jeremiah was in fact prophesying about a future event while also, talking about the present. He was prophesying about the future while simultaneously making a statement about the present. Matthew shows us that there are clear parallels between these women weeping over their sons being taken into exile and these women in Bethlehem and the surrounding areas weeping over their young sons who have just been massacred by Herod. So whether Jeremiah knew it or not at the time, he absolutely was prophesying about this massacre that was going to take place in Bethlehem, while simultaneously writing about the Israelites being shipped off to Babylon. I know it's really hard to find anything positive to talk about in a passage like this, but it really is just crazy. It's pretty mind-boggling to me when you think about the power that the Lord has and how he is literally controlling everything all throughout time, so much so that he allowed Jeremiah to prophesy about something that was going to happen hundreds or thousands of years later, and Jeremiah didn't even know it. Jeremiah thought he was writing about something that was happening then, and he was, yet God was using him not just to write a statement about the present, but to also make a prophecy, a messianic prophecy about something that was going to happen in the future. I know it's confusing. This prophecy stuff is confusing, but it's fascinating to me. I absolutely love it. And now we go on to the last section of this chapter, verses 19 through 23. Sometime not too long after Herod's massacre of all the young male children in Bethlehem, Herod died. He passed away. And around the time when he died, an angel appeared to Joseph in Egypt and told Joseph, hey, Herod's dead. You can now come back to Israel. And so Joseph gets married, gets baby Jesus, and they travel back to Israel. Now, finally, the prophecy from verse 15 in this chapter is fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son, because finally Jesus, baby Jesus, the Messiah, came out of Egypt. But there was a problem. The assumption is that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were just going to head back to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born and where they had stayed for the early months and maybe years of his life. But it tells us that Joseph found out that Herod's son, Archelaus, was now ruling over Judea. And apparently Archelaus was just as crazy as his father, because Joseph was very nervous to go back home, to go back to Bethlehem. And sure enough, the Lord once again appears to Joseph in a dream and tells Joseph, don't go back to Bethlehem, go to Galilee and go settle down in a little town called Nazareth. So that's what they did. Just for clarity, let me explain this to you. The regions of Galilee and Judea were both within the nation of Israel, but when Herod died, he had many sons who split up the nation of Israel in different parts. So Archelaus would have at this time been ruling over the region of Judea. Bethlehem, Jerusalem, they would have been in Judea, but he would not have had any power in Galilee, and that's where the small town of Nazareth was. That's where God directed Joseph and his family to go. Hey guys, I misspoke in that earlier section, so I just wanted to clarify very quickly. Herod was not the ruler over the entire nation of Israel at any point in time. He was the ruler over the region of Judea within the nation of Israel, and when he passed away, he had multiple sons who split up Judea among themselves. So the area of Judea where Bethlehem was the area that his son Archelaus was ruling over, and Joseph was scared to go back to that region because he knew that Archelaus was just as crazy as his father. So that is what I meant to say. I'll let you get back to the video. So they went to Galilee, and they settled down in a little town called Nazareth. And as far as we knew, that is where Jesus grew up. That was his hometown. He grew up, he matured, he was raised in the little town of Nazareth. And just to put the cherry on top, Matthew writes that this too was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. He tells us in verse 23, he quotes a prophecy that says, "He shall be called a Nazarene." What's really interesting about this prophecy and what's interesting about these words that he quotes is that it's not actually a quote from the Old Testament. Nowhere in the Old Testament can you find these words, "He shall be called a Nazarene." That's nowhere found in the Old Testament. So what is Matthew quoting? What is he saying? What's this prophecy that he's referring to? Well, the truth is this is not actually a fulfillment of an actual literal prophecy. This is more a fulfillment of a prophetic theme throughout the Old Testament. What Matthew meant by this prophecy fulfillment is that the little town of Nazareth was a relatively unimportant and unknown place, okay, in the grand scheme of things. This is not a place you would have ever expected to find a king of any kind. And this is not a place that any Israelites would have expected the Messiah to be born. However, there are numerous prophecies throughout the Old Testament about the Messiah saying that the Messiah would have very humble and lowly beginnings, that the Messiah would kind of come out of nowhere. And because of this, many of his own people would meet him with hesitancy at first, and many would meet him with full-on rejection. These are very, very common themes of messianic prophecy throughout the Old Testament. So when Matthew says in verse 23, "He shall be called a Nazarene," what he's really saying is that he will be a nobody who comes kind of out of nowhere. And those things, those themes are absolutely prophesied about in the Old Testament. So Matthew's not quoting a specific prophecy here at the end of Matthew chapter 2. He's quoting a prophetic theme. Matthew is saying all throughout the Old Testament, the Messiah is prophesied as someone with lowly beginnings, a nobody from the middle of nowhere, and him living and being raised and coming out of the town of Nazareth is a fulfillment of those things. Once again, this prophecy fulfillment is a little different, structured a little differently, but it's pretty cool if you ask me. I love all of this prophecy stuff in Matthew's gospel. It's so fascinating to me. It's just super cool to me to see all of the different ways that Matthew goes about supporting his argument for Jesus being the Messiah. And in my opinion, he's doing a pretty dang good job so far after these first two chapters. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of Matthew chapter 2. We did it. We got through this chapter. Now, before we go, however, there are a few things that I want to point out for you really quick. A few either kind of fun facts or very important things about either this chapter or the first two chapters of this gospel as a whole. Just 4 things that I want to point out for you really quick that I think are of importance. Okay, number 1, this is more of the fun fact than anything else, but in these first 2 chapters of his gospel, Matthew records the Lord speaking to people directly through dreams a total of 5 different times. I want to point that out. That's pretty cool to me, seeing as the Lord has never directly spoken to me in a dream. Maybe he will one day. I'm still holding out hope for that. But I think this was intentional. I think Matthew was trying to highlight how directly involved God was during these early days of the birth and formative years of his son. God was active and God was directing and guiding the steps of everyone involved. And we see that through 5 dreams, and we see that through some kind of star, some kind of supernatural light that the Lord used to guide these wise men, right? There's so many things in just these first 2 verses, so many different ways that we see the Lord active and directly involved, guiding his people in every single step. Number 2, the second thing I want to point out is going back to the last video in the beginning of this second chapter. I think it's really important and really crucial to note that the very first people we see in the entire New Testament to acknowledge Jesus as king and to come to him, to worship him, to bring him gifts, they were not Israelites, not his own chosen people. They were Gentiles. These men, the wise men, were not Israelites, right? They were Gentiles. I don't think this was an accident either. I think that this was God's way of kind of foreshadowing that Jesus was going to be the one to make salvation available to all peoples, both Jews and Gentiles. From here on out, God's chosen people are no longer the Israelites. God's chosen people are anyone and everyone who follow him, who surrender their lives to him, who put their faith in him as their Lord and Savior. Anybody, no matter your blood, no matter your heritage, no matter your race or ethnicity, can have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And by allowing the wise men to be the first people to acknowledge Jesus as king and to worship him, he kind of already hints at this very early on in the New Testament. Third thing I want to point out is something we began talking about in Matthew chapter 1, and we maybe even began talking about it in our introduction to this gospel. I talked to you about how one of the major things that Matthew does throughout his gospel is he tries to portray Jesus as a king. That's like the main thrust of his gospel, is he wants everyone reading his gospel to see Jesus as a king. And I just wanted to point out, is that not so obvious in this chapter of all places? There are numerous kingly references and themes throughout this chapter, like a powerful group of foreigners coming to look for this young king of the Jews, like an evil rival king seeking to defeat this young king, seeking to exterminate him, like these wise men coming and worshiping king and offering him gifts that would have only been fit for royalty, for a king. I mean, it is so clear in these first two chapters that not only is Matthew trying to portray Jesus as the Messiah, convince his readers that Jesus is the Messiah, but it's very, very clear that he also wants his readers to see and understand that Jesus is a king. I just want to point that out for you, since I've been talking about that ever since we started this study in the Gospel of Matthew. Number 4, as we wrap up, last thing that I wanted to point out for you is the uniqueness of this chapter. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as you know, there are 4 Gospels in the Bible, right? And all 4 Gospels tell the story of the same man's life, Jesus. And each one of these 4 Gospels has distinct features and characteristics that make them unique from the others. They all have something unique to offer, absolutely. But at the end of the day, if we're being honest, they are all telling the same story in a sense. So there is a lot of overlap. A lot of what we read in the Gospel of Matthew, if we're blessed by the Lord to be able to go through all 4 Gospels on this channel, you will see that a lot of what we read in this Gospel, we will also read at least versions of those stories and of those events in the other Gospels as well. There's a lot of overlap. But let me tell you something, okay? Fun fact. Everything that we talked about in this video and in the video before, everything we talked about in this chapter, Matthew chapter 2, can be found nowhere else in the other Gospels and nowhere else in the Bible. Everything in Matthew chapter 2 is completely unique to Matthew chapter 2. The stories of the wise men and Herod and the wise men meeting with Herod, the wise men coming to see baby Jesus, to worship him, presenting gifts to him. The stories of Joseph and Mary and Jesus fleeing to Egypt and then coming back and settling down in Nazareth. The story of Herod's massacre of the young male children in Bethlehem. All of these stories cannot be found anywhere else in the other Gospels. They're completely unique to the Gospel of Matthew. And it's pretty easy to understand why. It's not because Matthew had access to these stories and the other gospel writers didn't. It's not like Matthew knew somehow, he had some kind of source and he knew about all these things that happened in the early life of Jesus and the other gospel writers didn't know about them, so they didn't write them. No, that's not why. The other gospel writers didn't write about these things because they didn't feel like these stories were very important to the story they were trying to tell. Whatever it is that specifically they were trying to communicate to their readers, and we'll talk about that more as we get to those other gospels, they didn't feel like these stories were very important in progressing the narrative they were trying to share. But why was Matthew writing his gospel? Matthew was writing his gospel for the main reason of convincing his primarily Jewish audience that the man, Jesus of Nazareth, was the Messiah that was prophesied about in the Old Testament. And what did we see in this chapter? Everything that Matthew writes in this chapter was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, wasn't it? Like that purpose, Matthew's purpose, is seen more clearly in Matthew chapter 2 than maybe in any other chapter in his gospel, because he tells, I told you these 4 sections are centered around 4 Old Testament prophecies, because the only reason Matthew felt the need to share what he shared in this chapter was because he saw that this further helped to support his argument of Jesus being the Messiah. Literally everything in this chapter was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Everything in this chapter helped support his argument. That was his sole purpose in writing this chapter, and that was his main purpose throughout this entire gospel, right? These stories seemed insignificant to the other gospel writers. That's why they didn't write about them, but Matthew saw them as significant because he realized, wow, even in the early days of Jesus, when Jesus was months and years old, even then, things were happening in his life that prove he was the Messiah. There are things that were happening in his life that were prophesied about in the Old Testament. Matthew used these stories in this chapter to further strengthen his argument for Jesus being the Messiah. And like I said, in my opinion, through these first 2 chapters, he's doing a pretty dang good job. In 2 chapters, we've already seen 5 different prophecies from the Old Testament about the Messiah that have already been fulfilled in the life of Jesus. And Jesus may not even be a year old yet. He's already fulfilled 5 prophecies from the Old Testament about the Messiah. It's just amazing to me. It's amazing how Matthew's gospel is able to bridge this gap so easily and so fluidly between the Old Testament and the New Testament. man, I just love this book and I love talking about it. I'm so glad I've gotten the opportunity to talk to you more about this gospel. I cannot wait to continue to talk about this gospel with you, to dive into Matthew chapter 3, hopefully soon. I hope that you've enjoyed talking about this chapter as much as I did. If there was anything that you learned, anything you liked or disliked about this video, any questions you have, you can drop them down below in the comments, or you can email me at askaboutthebible89@gmail.com with any questions, any concerns, any prayer requests, anything like that. I would love to connect with some of you on a more personal level. I pray that you learned something. As I said, if you did learn something, if you enjoyed this video, then you can let me know by liking this video, subscribing to my channel, and sharing this video with anyone, Christian or not, who would be interested in talking about the Bible and having these conversations with us. Come back soon to continue to dive further into this gospel and to dive into Matthew chapter 3, okay? But until then, never stop talking.